When you picture the Old West, what comes to mind? Gunfights at high noon, cowboys riding into dusty towns, saloon girls, duels, outlaws, and sheriffs keeping order with a six-shooter and a squint. It's a world built by Hollywood. Romantic, violent, dramatic, and iconic. But here's the truth. Most of it never happened. At least, not the way you think. The real American frontier was dirtier, slower, more diverse, and far more complicated than the movies ever show. Gunfights were rare. Most people didn't own a horse. Saloons were often boring, and many of the outlaws weren't clever bandits. They were drunks, thugs, or desperate men who didn't last long. Hollywood gave us a version of the West that's fun to watch, but it's also wildly inaccurate. And over time, those myths stuck. They became part of our culture, our media, and our memory. But not anymore. In this video, we're breaking down the 10 biggest lies Hollywood told us about the Wild West and revealing what life was actually like on the frontier. Some will surprise you. Some will change how you see your favorite Westerns forever. Let's start with the biggest myth of them all, the non-stop, shoot-'em-up, gunfight-filled West. That never really was. Top 1. The Gunslinger Showdown. Why it rarely happened, and never like the movies. Turns out, high noon showdowns were mostly a Hollywood invention. Thanks to movies, most people believe the Old West was filled with dramatic shootouts. Every cowboy solving his problems with a pistol at his hip. But in reality, gunfights were rare, messy, and nothing like the choreographed duels we see on screen. Most towns had strict gun laws. Dodge City, Tombstone, and Deadwood all required visitors to check their weapons with the sheriff upon arrival. Open carry was often banned in town limits. People weren't walking around like they were in a Clint Eastwood movie, and when gunfights did happen, they weren't fair or glamorous. They were chaotic. Drunken arguments, ambushes in alleys, shots fired from behind, not two men politely facing off at noon. The famous gunfight at the OK Corral. It lasted less than 30 seconds. 3 people died. It wasn't noble, it was a street brawl. Most Old West deaths involved disease, accidents, or poor hygiene. Not bullets. But Hollywood loved the spectacle, so it gave us a version of the West where every argument ended in gunfire. In truth, surviving the West meant avoiding fights, not drawing your gun faster. Top 2. The Lone Rider. Most cowboys walked, not rode. The West wasn't full of galloping heroes. It was full of blisters. When you think of a cowboy, you picture him on horseback, riding through dust storms, chasing outlaws, or heading into town with a rifle slung over his back. But here's the truth. Most people in the Old West weren't riding. They were walking. A lot. Horses were expensive. They needed food, care, shoes, and shelter. For poor settlers, horses weren't a symbol of freedom. They were a financial burden. Most families had a single mule or a team of oxen to pull wagons. That was it. Even cowboys, the very people we associate with riding, spent more time on foot than in the saddle. Herding cattle often meant walking for hours, fixing fences, or guiding wagons through rough terrain. Riding was saved for when it was absolutely necessary, or when they were lucky enough to have a healthy horse. And when someone did ride into town, it usually meant one of 2 things. They had money, or they had business that couldn't wait. The idea that everyone rode across the frontier like some kind of Marlboro man? That's marketing, not history. The West was wide, but most people crossed it one dusty, blistered step at a time. Top 3. The White Cowboy Myth. 1 in 4 wasn't even white. Hollywood made them white. History says otherwise. In movies, cowboys are almost always rugged white men with southern drawls and squinty eyes. But the real cowboys, they were far more diverse, and many didn't look anything like John Wayne. Historians estimate that 1 in every 4 cowboys was black. After the Civil War, thousands of formerly enslaved men headed west in search of opportunity, and many found work on ranches, driving cattle, training horses, and doing the same jobs white cowboys did. They were skilled, respected, and essential. Mexican vaqueros, arguably the original cowboys, taught Americans how to rope, ride, and herd cattle long before the Wild West boom. Their influence is still seen in cowboy gear today. Chaps, lassos, spurs, even the word rodeo. And Native Americans? They didn't just fight settlers. Many worked as guides, scouts, or even ranch hands. In tough terrain, nobody knew the land better. So why don't we see them in westerns? Because Hollywood whitewashed the West, erasing the very people who built it. The cowboy wasn't just one kind of man. He was black, brown, native, poor, immigrant, and he probably wouldn't get cast in his own story. Top 4. The Wild Saloon Girl. Why most bars banned women and music. That swinging door saloon full of piano girls and party. Pure fiction. Hollywood loves the image. A smoky saloon, piano playing in the corner, women in corsets leaning on the bar, flirting with cowboys. But in the real Old West, most saloons weren't filled with music or women. They were filled with silence, sweat, and drunk men trying not to get stabbed. Early frontier saloons were rough, muddy, and mostly male-only spaces. Many banned women outright, not out of morality, but because it caused problems. Fights broke out, tensions flared. Some towns passed actual laws making it illegal for women to be in saloons after dark. Music? Not likely. Very few saloons had pianos, and fewer had someone to play them. Instruments were expensive, and most cowtowns didn't have anyone trained to entertain. Gambling tables and cheap whiskey were the main attractions. The saloon girl of Hollywood fame? She existed, but she was rare and often worked in brothels, not bars. Real saloon workers were usually male bartenders with clubs under the counter, not dancers with feather boas. So no, there wasn't a party every night. There was tension, sweat, spilled beer, and maybe a fight in the corner. And absolutely no one was singing "Oh, Susanna." Top 5. The Lawless Frontier. Some towns had stricter gun bans than New York. Turns out the Wild West was full of rules. We've all seen it. Dusty towns where everyone walks around with a revolver, ready to draw at any moment. A world with no law, no order, and justice served at the barrel of a gun. But the truth? Most frontier towns had gun laws, and some were stricter than cities today. Tombstone, Arizona, total weapon ban inside town limits. Dodge City? Signs at the city entrance warned, check your guns with the sheriff. Even Deadwood had ordinances that prohibited carrying firearms in public. Why? Because people were tired of getting shot over poker games and spilled drinks. Lawmakers, many of them former gunslingers themselves, wanted order. And they knew that too many armed men in a small saloon was a recipe for disaster. In fact, some towns had more gun control than modern cities like New York or Los Angeles. Guns were often banned in courthouses, saloons, dance halls, and anywhere alcohol was served. Hollywood gave us the image of lawless chaos. But in reality, many towns wanted peace, not bloodshed. The Wild West wasn't wild because of the law. It was wild despite it. And more often than not, the sheriff said, "No guns allowed." Top 6. The six-shooter fantasy. Many carried no gun at all. In the real West, walking around armed wasn't badass. It was suspicious. Movies loved to show everyone strapped with a revolver, on the hip, ready to fire. But in truth, most people didn't carry a gun at all, especially not in towns. Why? For starters, guns were expensive. A reliable six-shooter could cost the equivalent of several weeks' wages. Ammunition wasn't cheap either. Most settlers, ranchers, and shopkeepers simply couldn't afford to be armed. Secondly, they didn't need to. In most towns, crime wasn't rampant, and personal disputes were settled with fists or words, not bullets. Carrying a gun often made people nervous. It sent the message that you were expecting trouble. Many towns, like Tombstone or Dodge City, actually banned the public carrying of firearms. Visitors were required to turn in their weapons upon entering town. If you ignored the rule, you could be fined or jailed. Sure, ranchers or travelers might carry rifles outside town for protection from animals or bandits, but inside the city limits, guns were more likely to be locked away than worn in a holster. So that image of a whole town full of armed men, spinning revolvers and looking for a fight? Pure Hollywood. The truth is, the average man in the Old West left his gun at home and kept his head down. Top 7. The damsel in distress. Women owned property, guns, and power. They didn't wait to be rescued. They ran the damn town. Hollywood loves showing women in the Old West as background decoration, saloon girls, farmers' wives, or helpless victims clinging to the hero. But in the real frontier, women didn't just survive, they thrived, and often led. On the frontier, traditional gender roles didn't always apply. Women owned businesses, ran boarding houses, managed ranches, and even held legal property rights long before their counterparts in the East. In many territories, single women could own land, sue in court, and vote, decades before the national women's suffrage movement succeeded. They also knew how to shoot. A woman alone on a homestead couldn't count on a sheriff miles away. She kept a rifle above the door and knew how to use it. Many women were just as tough and just as armed as the men around them. Some became legends. Calamity Jane, Mary Fields, Stagecoach Mary, and Pearl Hart weren't waiting around to be rescued. They made their own rules. The truth is, the West was hard, and women who made it out there didn't do it by being delicate. They weren't damsels. They were dangerous, determined, and in charge. Top 8. The Robin Hood Outlaw. Most were just killers with bad timing. They didn't steal from the rich to help the poor. They just stole. Hollywood painted outlaws like Jesse James and Billy the Kid as rebellious folk heroes, men who stood up to corrupt bankers and gave back to the common man. In truth, most outlaws in the Old West were desperate, violent, and anything but noble. Jesse James wasn't robbing banks to help widows. He was robbing them for gold, often killing anyone who stood in the way. Billy the Kid? He didn't fight for justice. He fought for himself and was involved in multiple murders before the age of 21. Many outlaws were ex-Confederates, angry, armed, and looking for a cause or an excuse. Others were drifters, gamblers, and gang members. The few that tried to build reputations through newspapers or legends were still criminals at the core. And unlike the movies, most of them didn't die in epic duels. They were gunned down in ambushes, betrayed by friends, or captured while asleep in a shack. The Old West didn't need Robin Hoods. It had real heroes, settlers, builders, farmers. The outlaws just made life harder for them. They weren't legends. They were mistakes with a trigger finger. Top 9. The death by gun illusion. Disease, not bullets, was the real killer. In the West, it wasn't who shot first. It was who washed their hands. Hollywood gives the impression that everyone in the Old West died by gunfire, duels in dusty streets, ambushes in the dark. But statistically, you were far more likely to die from a fever than from a bullet. Doctors had limited knowledge of germs. Antibiotics didn't exist. Simple infections, cuts from barbed wire, a splinter, a rotten tooth, could become fatal. Childbirth was one of the deadliest experiences for women. Typhoid, cholera, dysentery, tuberculosis. These weren't just risks, they were facts of life. The water wasn't clean. The food was often spoiled. Hygiene was basic, at best. People reused towels, drank from shared buckets, and treated wounds with whiskey and wishful thinking. Gun violence did happen, sure, but it was rare and often sensationalized. Disease, on the other hand, was relentless and invisible. It took children, pioneers, soldiers, ranchers. No warning, no mercy. The real killer of the Old West didn't carry a six-shooter. It lived in the water, in the air, and in the hands of the people around you. Out there, death didn't always sound like a gunshot. Sometimes, it started with a cough. Top 10. The cowboy versus Indian trope. The West was more than just a war. The West wasn't just a battlefield, it was a neighborhood. Hollywood turned the American frontier into one long battle. Cowboys versus Indians, good versus evil, settlers versus savages. But that version erases the truth. The West wasn't just a war zone. It was a living, breathing, complicated place. Yes, violent conflict existed, massacres, betrayals, resistance, but so did trade, cooperation, cultural blending, and uneasy peace. Native Americans didn't just fight settlers, they traded with them, guided them through difficult terrain, and in some cases even lived alongside them. Some native groups became ranchers. Others worked as scouts for the U.S. military. Many were displaced, yes, but many adapted, resisted, or tried to negotiate for survival. Meanwhile, cowboys were a diverse group, often made up of Mexicans, black freedmen, and even Native Americans themselves. The idea that every white cowboy was a hero and every native warrior was a villain. That's lazy storytelling. The real West wasn't a simple face-off. It was a place of clashing cultures, shared spaces, broken promises, and stubborn survival. It wasn't black versus white. It was gray, dusty, complicated, human. The Old West we see in movies is thrilling. Fast draws, dusty duels, righteous cowboys, and outlaw legends. But the real West, it was slower, harder, messier, and far more human. There weren't shootouts every day. Most folks didn't carry a gun. The heroes didn't always wear a badge. And the villains weren't always evil. They were often just desperate. Women weren't helpless. Cowboys weren't all white. And Native Americans weren't just the enemy. The real frontier was a blend of struggle and survival, a place shaped by hard choices and harsh conditions, not dramatic standoffs and stylized violence. But that doesn't make it boring. In fact, it makes it even more powerful. Because when you strip away the movie myths, what's left is the real story. Ordinary people pushing through extraordinary hardships, carving lives out of wilderness, building towns, raising families, and fighting for something better, even if history forgot their names. If this video changed how you see the Wild West, or made you rethink what Hollywood taught us, hit subscribe. We've got plenty more truth beneath the myths, because history isn't always what we were told. Sometimes it's grittier, sometimes it's darker, but it's always worth uncovering. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one, where we keep digging up what really happened, not just what made it to the movies.